Hey, welcome to Faith and Culture Now. Today I'm joined by Dr. Scott Bridger. It's good to have you here, Dr. Bridger.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So, Dr. Bridger is the program director for the Bachelor of Arts in Christian Ministries here at Criswell College, and he has a lot of experience with different cultures, and he teaches a number of really interesting classes here at the school, such as world religions, history and theology and missions, and he even spent a number of years overseas. He's fluent in Arabic, and he just has a lot of great insights on how to deal with and how to learn about other cultures. And so we're going to be talking today about the importance of just having good communication and positive communication and good understanding of other people groups, especially in the event that you try to foster relationships with people who may live around you, but who may not be of the same background and same culture that you are. So, with that being said, why is it important to learn about other cultures and how other people do things?
Well, as believers, we've been commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves, right?
Right.
And so the first part of loving your neighbor is knowing your neighbor. And so if you want to truly love your neighbor, then you need to know things about them. Their background, their history, their language, if they speak a different language in the home, for instance, holidays, different things like that. So knowledge, in some sense, precedes our ability to really follow the Great Commandment, the Great Commission, and love our neighbor.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
And I think, you mentioned, even holidays. A lot of different cultures celebrate some of the same holidays we do in America. They don't always even celebrate them on the same days.
Correct.
I think of Chinese New Year as an example, which I don't even remember what month it occurs in, but it's not when we have New Year.
Correct.
So
correct. The Persians have a New Year. There are lots of different calendars out there even that people go by. A Jewish calendar in Judaism, for instance.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Well, the next thing I want to talk about just briefly is why is it important to be mindful of other cultures when you're interacting with people of those cultures?
Yeah. So stepping way back,
Yeah.
culture and diversity, whether it's cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity, was a part of God's original plan. If you look back in Genesis, God says to us, image bearers, male and female, that we are to multiply and fill the earth. Well, had we obeyed that command fully, natural kind of diversity would have developed. There would have been a natural development of, over time and in different places, of races and languages and things like that. Well, what we do, you fast forward through from Genesis 1 to the Tower of Babel, Genesis 10, 11, in that area, and you see what we do is we congregate in one place. God then enters into the picture, sees our disobedience, and disperses us. Well, his original intention was that we would disperse, and he confuses our language. Well, we would have naturally developed different languages. And so that was a part of God's original plan.
Yeah.
He forces us to do that. So we should embrace it. And the gospel ultimately is about understanding, knowing the one God, the one true God, loving Him appropriately, and all the diversity that we have in the world is ultimately meant and designed to bring glory to God.
Yeah, certainly. I think of even our own country, right? I mean, you have people that have different accents based on where they're geographically located, right? So somebody from Texas is going to have a draw that people from New York aren't going to have.
Yeah.
And that's just within the same language. And then you look at other people groups throughout the world, and in a lot of places you find that even when people speak the same language, they have different dialects.
That's correct.
And as a result, you have to sort of know not only what this person's language is, but what dialect do they adhere to in order to really understand.
I teach Arabic. That's one of the languages that I teach. And in the curriculum that we use, we have formal written language, and then there are multiple dialects, spoken dialects, some of which are mutually incomprehensible. And Arabic is like that, Spanish is actually like that, Chinese and some others that we think of as one language, when in fact the dialects within those languages can be so diverse that people that speak that same language can't even actually understand each other. So there's a lot of diversity underneath the surface of what we actually just see with our eyes.
Yeah, very good. So why is it that when we are trying to make new relationships with people. Say, I'm not talking about going overseas and
Sure.
you go visit France. You should try to understand their customs and culture.
Obviously.
But when people, especially in America, so many people coming to America from other places, I can look, down the street and I can see, on my own block, there's people from 4 or 5 different places.
Yeah.
So there are multiple cultures of people all around us.
Correct.
So why is it important for us to sort of understand that in sort of even developing those relationships
Yeah.
in our own backyard, if you will?
Yeah, I think some of the principles that people use if they are going to live in China or France or an African nation or the Middle East or someplace else, some of those principles that we use and teach to people going into intercultural conversations or cross-cultural conversations are actually applicable in our own backyards and in our own neighborhoods here, particularly if you live in a society that is immigrant friendly, or that cultures and countries where they encourage immigration from a lot of different nations. I think believers especially need to actually know those principles and apply those principles in their relationships in their neighborhoods. And the first principle, I would just say, the most important one, is that you always want to step back and observe before you interpret. Observe before you interpret. For instance, one of the textbooks I use in one of my classes talks about 2 statements. Let me compare 2 statements. One, that man is speaking loudly, versus that man is angry. The first one is an observation. That man is speaking loudly. The second one is an interpretation. That man is angry. Some languages are just louder than other languages.
Sure.
Some cultures are louder than other languages. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should interpret them as being angry, for instance. And so those 2 principles, observation and interpretation, you really need to observe before you interpret. And once you have knowledge and can make accurate interpretations, you can do so. But really, observation is necessary prior to that.
Oh yeah, I can, even just thinking about English-speaking groups of people, right? In England, people tend to be more direct, more straightforward. They tend to be more confrontational. And if someone from England were to say, come to Texas and implement some of those same practices, it would be easy for us to go, oh, that person's so rude.
Yeah.
But if we step back and look at our practices, right, where people tend to be very passive-aggressive and other things like that you get in the South, they would look at us and go, why don't you guys just get to the point?
That's right.
And
That's
so
right.
it's when we start putting interpretation on something too early, we end up missing out on really understanding where the person's coming from.
Which as disciples we want to do. That goes back to the whole thing we started off with, which is ultimately I need to love this person, even if that person's my enemy, however that's defined. And so knowledge is necessary, and so observation becomes necessary to attain and obtain accurate knowledge of somebody or a culture. 2 kind of values that are important when there's conflict over a controversial topic are the extent to which a culture values emotional expressiveness. Is that valued or is that not valued? In some East Asian cultures, emotional expressiveness is not valued,
right?
Like public displays of emotion. Whereas in America, some is okay, but too much is not. Whereas in like Greece or Mediterranean cultures or the Middle East or some other cultures, a lot of emotional if you don't express yourself emotionally, then you're not taken seriously. You don't actually care about what you're talking about. So that's one. And the other one is direct and indirect, kind of like what you were talking about. How direct can you be with somebody in talking to them about a controversial topic, or do you need to address it more indirectly?
Yeah. And I think those are really good observations.
Yeah.
And in America, when we think about our emotions and how they get involved, typically when someone gets really emotional, it's okay, you need to calm down and you need to really think about this.
Step back from it.
Yeah, like you're getting too connected, too involved.
Right. Which is, it shows you that we're sensitive. Too much public display of emotion is valued negatively
right.
in this culture, whereas that's not necessarily the case in other cultures. So.
Yeah, very good. And so I think, that sort of leads into this idea that, we want to have good conversations with people of other cultures to get to know them. So we've got to be sensitive to, their background, where they come from. We've got to be sensitive to how people interact in their culture. But, inevitably, because people are from different places, they're going to run into issues where they don't see eye to eye. So the question is, how can you continue to foster a relationship with somebody with whom you don't really agree with about anything, religion, politics, or even just day to day things you would do around the house. So,
Right. So some strategies as disciples, I think we should, generally speaking, always seek a win-win situation. Some relationships, depends on the nature of a relationship. Some relationships can handle and should handle a lot of controversy, and you should be able to really deal with that in an open way. A marriage relationship, for instance, is one wherein you would want to be open about dealing with conflict and issues. Other relationships can't handle the pressure of a lot of controversy. And so you have to gauge, is this a relationship that can handle pressure? If it is, then I need to work towards a win-win if possible. It's not always possible to work towards a win-win where both sides walk away from it sensing that they've, in some sense, won, or in some sense have completed or achieved a goal, whatever that is. But that's not always the case. And so when dealing with conflict, again, those emotional expressiveness comes into play, direct and indirect communication comes into play. And how much, to what extent do you want to die on a hill, to use that metaphor, right? Some issues, oftentimes believers will get caught up about, they'll make mountains out of molehills, to use molehills, to use another metaphor. And we need discernment.
Right.
What issues are important?
Aren't really things we need to deal with. I think of years and years ago, several hundred years ago, when Christians would send missionaries, especially out of Europe, to other countries, because there weren't really people here at this point. So they would send missionaries, and one of the first things they would do is basically say, you people need to adopt our culture and our faith. And the two aren't mutually going together, And so in more recent missions practices, what you see is that when missionaries go overseas, they tend to learn that culture and then say, how is our faith applicable in your culture without making you change everything about yourself? And I think that we sort of still fall into that older trap, at least in the Bible Belt here in America, where when we are looking at people of other cultures and trying to share the gospel with them, we don't just want them to accept our faith, we want them to accept our own traditions.
Our civilization, There are lots of examples of bad examples throughout missions history. There are a lot of good examples from the time of the Bible throughout missions history as well of those who recognize that adopting the faith doesn't necessarily mean adopting all the cultural practices that come with the messenger who's brought the faith to me. You see this controversy actually in the book of Acts, Acts 15 with the Jerusalem Council. And there are lots of examples of it throughout history. So the gospel actually embraces a person where they are, how they are, but yet doesn't leave any of us as we are. It challenges all the idolatries that all of us have in all of our cultures, even the ones we're not aware of. And the challenge for believers is to gain critical distance from their own culture so that they can say, hey, maybe this is an idolatry in my culture, whereas I can easily maybe identify something in the speck in my brother's eye, whereas I have a plank in my own. And so we need discernment.
It reminds me of a few years ago, J.L. Mackie, who was a very prominently well-known philosophical atheist. He taught at Oxford, I believe, for many, many years. And a few years ago, he said, I am no longer an atheist. I've determined that based on new scientific research that there has to be a greater being out there. But then he said, but I hope it's not the God of Christianity, because the idea of being stuck singing hymns in a worship service for eternity really bores me. And
He needs to go to an African traditional
Yeah,
kind of
that's right.
African worship service in Kenya or someplace like this, and
Yeah.
I think he'd get a different taste and flavor of what Christian worship is.
Definitely so. But, I think, when you think about, even in the British culture, right, or in the American culture, this idea that, when we get to heaven, we're just going to be singing all the time. Well, that's not really a biblical idea.
Right.
There will be worship taking place in heaven, and I think there will be singing.
Yeah.
But to think that that's exclusively all it is sort of a misnomer of our tradition.
Yeah, it's a
and our
myth.
culture.
It's really a myth also that somehow a disembodied heavenly kind of state is ultimately what we're destined for. It's actually a
Right.
new heavens and a new earth, where we see in the book of Revelation where every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, i.e. every culture in some sense is represented before the throne, worshiping the Lamb, united by a common faith in Christ on in a new heavens and new earth that's been restored, and yet still preserving cultural, linguistic, and racial diversity, and that's the beauty of the gospel.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, what really I sort of take away from some of this is that we need to be students of other cultures, and we need to be students of our own culture, and we need to learn what things we're doing that are right, what things we're doing that are not right, in relation to our faith and the Bible. And then when it comes to having conversations with people of other faiths and other cultures, we need to be learning, their traditions. We need to learn what they believe. We need to understand where they're coming from. I actually know a guy who a number of years ago became a Christian because he read in the Gospel of Matthew the genealogy of Jesus. And most people go, oh, those genealogies, I have to read those again. They're so boring.
Right.
And this guy said, in my culture, because he's not from here, he said, in my culture, if there's no genealogy, it's a myth.
Yeah.
But if there's a genealogy, it's true. And so he had heard the gospel, and he thought, well, that's a good story. When he saw the genealogy, he said, oh my goodness, I have to believe this.
Yeah, Jesus is the promised one of the seed of Abraham, the seed of David, the one that ultimately brings God's blessing to every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And it's really, and of course the genealogies are demonstrating that Jesus is the one who fulfills all that. And that's great. I think that he captured and understood something that maybe those of us with Western eyes might miss, but is there for a reason and a purpose and speaks to those from cultures like that, and which is a reflection of really also of biblical value and culture as well.
Certainly. So, as you watch this video, I hope that it'll help encourage you to learn more about the people you have the opportunity to interact with. If you work with some people from another culture, get to know them a little bit better, get to understand their background. If you have people in your neighborhood, you have people visiting your church who are from other nationalities, other geographic locations, get to know them. And then as you get to know them, think about how you can communicate the love of Christ with them in a way that brings God honor, but also in a way that they can understand based on your own openness and willingness to sort of get a glimpse into how they think and to be in being respectful with their own traditions. So
Yeah, that's good. I hope so too.
all right. Well, thank you guys for your time today. We'll see you next time.